Grant Mercer entered the courtroom in a tailored suit, backed by expensive attorneys, wearing the face of a man who believed money could rewrite memory. He pointed right at me and declared to the judge, "She built nothing." The room waited for me to crumble. Instead, the judge turned to the company's chief financial officer and asked one simple question about a company loan from years ago. Immediately, his entire fabricated empire started collapsing. My name is Bryn Chapman. I am 39 years old, and as I sat rigid in the Mecklenburg County Family Court, the heavy oak doors closing behind me sounded less like a simple room being shut and more like the violent ceiling of a steel vault. I wore a charcoal wool dress, devoid of sharp patterns, devoid of any loud statement. My hair was pulled back tightly, minimalist, invisible. It was precisely the way my husband had trained the corporate world to see me over the last decade. My demeanor was so entirely still, so completely devoid of the typical tremors of a woman having her life dismantled, that the court clerks and opposing counsel cast sideways glances at me. They could not decide if I was completely terrified and paralyzed by the moment, or if I had prepared for this exact day for a very long time. He walked into the room exactly 4 minutes late. Grant Mercer, the chief executive officer of Ironcrest Transit Systems, did not merely enter a space, he acquired it. He strode down the center aisle wearing a bespoke navy suit that undoubtedly cost over $5,000, flanked by a phalanx of 3 high-priced litigators who carried their leather briefcases like battlefield gear. To Grant, this was not the devastating dissolution of a 12-year marriage. This was not a tragedy. This was a hostile takeover defense. He carried the posture of a man walking into a Series C funding round, fully prepared to dazzle a room full of skeptical venture capitalists. He did not look at me. To him, I was no longer a wife. I was simply a depreciating asset that needed to be aggressively written off the books. When the bailiff called the room to order and the initial proceedings began, the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. The plaintiff's counsel wasted zero time launching into the dissection of our shared history. When the critical topic of marital assets finally breached the sterile, tense air, Grant did not cower behind his lead attorney. He leaned forward into the microphone. His posture was offensively relaxed, his voice dropping into that calculated, resonant baritone he always used to command boardroom tables and suppress dissenting opinions. The current valuation of Ironcrest Transit Systems is a direct and exclusive result of my sole vision, Grant stated, his eyes sweeping the gallery before landing with feigned humility on the judge. Bryn was my wife, yes. I cared for her, but she simply lived adjacent to the business. She was a passive beneficiary of its yield, never an architect of its structure. The air in the room grew suffocatingly thin. His lead attorney, a shark in a gray pinstripe suit, prompted him further, intentionally setting up the tee for Grant to take his most violent swing. Could you clarify Mrs. Mercer's operational role during the company's scaling phase, specifically during the rapid expansion in year 4 and year 5, the lawyer asked, his tone dripping with manufactured innocence. Grant offered a faint, almost pitying smile. It was the smile of a benevolent king forced to execute a treasonous peasant. "She built nothing," Grant replied. The words hit the varnished wood of the defense table like heavy, dropped coins. "She generated zero revenue," Grant continued, his voice gaining a cruel, rhythmic momentum. "She brought zero strategic value to the executive team. She did not write a single line of code for our routing software. She did not secure a single Tier 1 logistics contract. She managed our household, which I funded 100% out of my own compensation, allowing her to live an exceptionally comfortable, sheltered life while I bled to build an empire from the ground up." I did not flinch. I did not gasp, bite my lip, or drop my gaze to my lap in shame. I kept my breathing measured, counting 2 seconds in, 2 seconds out. Instead of reacting to the man actively trying to erase my existence on the public record, my gaze drifted to the gallery sitting directly behind the plaintiff's table. Sitting in the second row, clutching a manila folder like a life preserver, was Nolan Pike, the chief financial officer of Ironcrest. Nolan wore a silk tie that was knotted slightly too tight against his throat. He kept aggressively adjusting his French cuffs. He looked at the acoustic ceiling tiles. He studied the brass hinges on the swinging wooden gate. He watched the court reporter's flying fingers with intense fascination. He looked absolutely everywhere except at me. Nolan knew the exact, crushing weight of the lies currently polluting the court record. He knew what the company ledgers actually said before they were legally sanitized. High above us on the mahogany bench sat Judge Evelyn Harrow. For the first 45 minutes of the hearing, she had been a flawless portrait of judicial neutrality. She flipped through the massive, 300-page preliminary asset disclosure binder, her expression an impassive mask of bureaucratic boredom. But Grant was making a fatal, arrogant error. He was simply too smooth. His narrative was too heavily polished. In a family court, there is always collateral damage. There is always blood on the floor. Grant was presenting a blood-soaked mess as a perfectly controlled operation. Judge Harrow slowly stopped turning the pages. She pushed her thick reading glasses down the bridge of her nose. She stopped looking at the meticulously fabricated legal filings and started actively listening to the dangerous timbre of Grant's arrogance. Her eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. It was a microscopic shift, but in a courtroom, a judge's focused silence is louder than a gavel strike. She was no longer just presiding. She was hunting for the fracture in his armor. I could see the exact, brutal strategy his legal team was deploying. It was a classic, high-net-worth war of attrition. They wanted to control the tempo of the room from minute one. They needed to systematically demean the wife, strip away her agency on the permanent record, and paint her into the pathetic corner of the spoiled, dependent spouse who was now throwing a desperate tantrum because her unlimited platinum credit card was being permanently revoked. They wanted to exhaust me emotionally. They wanted to humiliate me so profoundly in this public forum that by the time the court called for the mandatory lunch recess, I would be shattered. They calculated that I would be so desperate to make the public flogging stop that I would blindly sign whatever insulting, low-value settlement agreement they slid across the table. They genuinely believed they were dictating the absolute terms of my surrender. I shifted my weight in the stiff wooden chair and looked down at the table in front of me. Sitting there, positioned neatly between my own lawyer's manicured hands, was a faded, heavy navy blue binder. Its plastic edges were heavily frayed. The protective sleeves inside were slightly yellowed from age and excessive handling. It did not look like a slick corporate prospectus or a pristine legal brief. It looked like a bruised relic, and it was the absolute, undeniable, paper-trailed truth of the year our startup almost collapsed into bankruptcy. Grant continued his theatrical monologue on the witness stand, detailing how he routinely worked 90-hour weeks, how he single-handedly navigated the catastrophic supply chain crisis, how he alone bore the crushing psychological weight of payroll. He was passionately painting a masterpiece of his own mythology. I let him paint. I let him use every single vibrant color of his delusion, because looking at that frayed, ugly binder, a profound, icy calm washed over my entire nervous system, settling deep into my bones. I realized something that fundamentally shifted the axis of the room. Today was not the day I was going to stand up, raise my voice, and beg this judge to believe me. Today was not the day I would cry over stolen credit, vanished titles, or a deliberately rewritten history. I did not need to defend my worth against a man who had built a career on my unseen labor. Today was the day a wildly successful, incredibly arrogant man was going to be methodically dismantled by the very testimony he was currently giving under oath. Before I was the silent, discarded wife, sitting rigidly in a courtroom, before Grant convinced a room full of highly paid lawyers that I was merely a decorative accessory to his corporate genius, I was the person who fixed fundamentally broken machines. At 28 years old, I was a senior process optimization specialist at Northvale Process Group. Northvale was not a place for wide-eyed visionaries or charismatic dreamers. It was a brutal, aggressively pragmatic environment where failing corporate supply chains were sent to either be surgically resurrected or mercifully dismantled. My daily life consisted of walking into bloated, profoundly disorganized companies and finding exactly where they were bleeding capital. I did not traffic in inspiration or motivational speeches. I dealt in supply bottlenecks, heavy load balancing, root cause operational analysis, and cold, hard, unyielding efficiency. I met Grant in the early fall of 2011. We were both attending a massive regional freight and logistics expo in Charlotte. He was 30 years old and aggressively pitching a theoretical tech-forward freight brokerage that he swore would completely disrupt the entire eastern seaboard. He had the crisp, tailored suit, the relentless eye contact, and the commanding hand gestures of a man who absolutely refused to be ignored by anyone in the room. He stood at a podium in a crowded breakout session, enthusiastically promising potential investors a 30% reduction in deadhead miles using a proprietary algorithmic routing system he had conceptualized. The crowd was visibly captivated by his kinetic energy, but as I watched his presentation, I realized his slide deck was an absolute operational nightmare. I stood near the heavy wooden back doors, holding a lukewarm cup of bitter coffee, reading the massive, glaring gaps in his financial and operational projections. When he finally opened the floor for questions, I did not ask about his theoretical market share or his future brand identity. I raised my hand and asked precisely how his software accounted for the newly mandated federal driver layover regulations, and exactly how his projected cash burn rate was supposed to survive a brutal net 90-day invoice cycle from Tier 1 commercial carriers. The entire room went dead silent. A lesser man would have become immediately defensive or tried to awkwardly pivot the conversation using empty corporate jargon. Grant did neither. He stopped talking, looked at me through the sea of seated executives, and smiled. It was the intense, hungry look of a man who had just found the missing engine block to a sports car he was desperately trying to build. He deliberately cornered me by the registration tables an hour later. He did not offer a cheesy pickup line or try to buy me a drink. He looked right into my eyes and said, "You saw the floorboards missing? That was the hook." That was the moment I was caught. Our early courtship was completely devoid of flickering candlelight, expensive imported wine, or white linen tablecloths. Our third date was spent sitting cross-legged on the cheap hardwood floor of my cramped apartment until 2 in the morning. We ate cold takeout Thai food straight from the cardboard containers, while I took a heavy red pen to his entire Year 1 operating budget. I ruthlessly rebuilt his fragile financial projections on a massive, complex spreadsheet. I mathematically mapped out realistic, functional transport routes. I completely rewrote his deeply flawed, overly optimistic hiring matrix. I found the critical business-ending friction points in his proposed software workflow and painstakingly built manual redundancies to catch the inevitable technical failures. I fell deeply in love with a man who had the sheer, intoxicating audacity to kick down heavy, locked doors. He possessed a fearless, almost reckless forward momentum that I naturally lacked. And Grant fell in love with a woman who would quietly walk into the room right behind him, pick up the splintered wood, and methodically build a functional, weight-bearing staircase out of the wreckage. We were two vital halves of a functioning industrial machine. He passionately sold the grand dream to the world, and I aggressively made sure the dream did not collapse under its own weight and crush us both in the process. We married 2 years later. There was absolutely no wealth then. Ironcrest Transit Systems was a grand, imposing corporate name for a profoundly depressing daily reality. Our first actual headquarters was a cramped, 600-square-foot sublet on the second floor of a decaying commercial strip on the very edge of the city's industrial district. The narrow office smelled perpetually of harsh industrial chemical solvent from the failing dry cleaner downstairs and burnt filter coffee from our cheap breakroom machine. We worked side by side on 3 wobbly laminated desks bought from a local bankruptcy liquidation sale. The primary laser printer jammed violently every single time we tried to run a vendor contract longer than 10 pages. Grant would pace the stained, incredibly thin carpet for 10 hours a day, making relentless cold calls to skeptical venture capitalists, selling them a billion-dollar empire with total conviction. I sat in the corner desk, silently holding our fragile shoestring reality together with digital tape and sheer force of will. By the middle of year 3, the operational chaos finally caught up with his incredible sales pitch. Grant had successfully secured massive, lucrative delivery contracts that our infant duct-taped infrastructure absolutely could not fulfill. The beta routing system was collapsing entirely under the heavy weight of the new data volume. Seasoned drivers were aggressively threatening to quit en masse because payroll processing was delayed by weeks at a time. The company was rapidly bleeding out on the operating table. At that exact time, I was pulling down a very secure 6-figure salary at North Vale, firmly on track for a lucrative executive partnership. But I watched my husband actively drowning in the deep end of his own ambition. On a random Tuesday morning, I walked into my manager's corner office, handed in my formal resignation letter, and walked away from my entire career. I voluntarily gave up my own professional stability to step directly into Grant's burning building full-time. I made that terrifying financial and professional leap because I fundamentally believed that a marriage was a joint enterprise, a single, unified entity fighting against the world. When you are building a life from the dirt up with someone you love, you do not keep petty, separate ledgers of sacrifice. I immediately took over the tangled supply chain logistics. I handled all the hostile, screaming vendor relations. I drafted the emergency routing protocols that saved our biggest, most critical accounts from terminating their contracts. But I did not ask to be legally listed on the capitalization table as a recognized co-founder. I did not demand a fancy C-suite title with a heavy brass nameplate on my office door. Whenever the wealthy angel investors came to tour our cramped, noisy office to see where their money was going, I would quietly step into the background. I would hand over the heavily polished operational reports and step back, letting Grant fully command the room. I allowed him to take the full, unfiltered credit for the flawlessly running systems I had built with my own hands the night before. I was the silent, internal engine, and he was the shiny, heavily marketed chassis. At the time, in my naive, absolute devotion to our shared future, I truly believed that the grueling, invisible labor you put into a marriage did not require a formal corporate title to be recognized as real. I thought the exceptional quality of the work simply spoke for itself. I thought that because I was his wife, my massive contributions were inherently, legally woven into the very fabric of his success. I thought he saw every single late night, every single crisis averted, every single sacrifice made. I truly thought that no matter how high he climbed the ladder, he would always remember exactly who poured the concrete foundation when he was too busy looking up at the sky. I authored the absolute first comprehensive operational blueprint for the company. It was not a visionary manifesto filled with hollow corporate buzzwords meant to impress wealthy investors. It was a brutal, highly pragmatic, 400-page manual of pure, unadulterated execution. I built the entire architecture of our daily survival from absolute scratch. I drafted the meticulous, step-by-step cross-docking protocols that prevented highly sensitive freight from sitting stagnant on the warehouse floor. I implemented the strict, uncompromising vendor scorecards that legally forced our third-party commercial carriers to maintain a 98% on-time delivery rate or face severe financial penalties. I designed the granular, minute-by-minute delay tracking matrices. I wrote the aggressive contract penalty enforcement mechanisms that ensured we actually collected revenue when our supply chain partners inevitably failed to perform. Grant was incredibly skilled at selling the glittering promise of unprecedented speed to the market, but I was the singular architect who poured the concrete and laid the heavy steel tracks that kept his runaway train from derailing into a massive financial ravine. The heavy, suffocating reality of our rapid expansion hit us hard when we desperately needed to secure our first physical commercial distribution hub. Grant was euphoric, completely blinded by the illusion of immediate growth. He wanted to immediately sign whatever dense, highly predatory commercial lease agreement the corporate landlord slid across the boardroom table, simply so he could hold the shiny new keys and announce our massive expansion to the industry press. I physically intercepted the 50-page legal document before his pen could touch the paper. I spent 72 straight hours locked in my office, aggressively redlining the master lease agreement line by agonizing line. Buried deep within the dense, intentionally confusing legal jargon, I uncovered a highly toxic, deliberately hidden covenant regarding mandatory cubic foot capacity minimums and exorbitant, paralyzing early termination fees. If Grant had blindly signed his name on that dotted line, that single predatory operational clause would have completely drained our entire operating cash flow within exactly 6 months. I stepped in, ruthlessly negotiated with the aggressive leasing agents, leveraged our projected seasonal freight volume against their empty warehouse space, and legally forced them to strike the clause entirely before I allowed the company to move a single wooden pallet inside the facility. The true terrifying test of our fragile logistical infrastructure occurred late in the fourth quarter. It was the absolute peak of the holiday shipping rush, the exact critical moment when our daily delivery volume quadrupled overnight. Without a single warning, the highly touted proprietary algorithmic routing software that Grant constantly bragged about to the tech media suffered a massive, catastrophic internal data failure. The large tracking screens across the entire dispatch floor went completely black. Hundreds of our long-haul commercial trucks were suddenly flying totally blind across 3 different states, carrying millions of dollars in perishable and time-sensitive cargo. Grant immediately locked himself in his private office with the lead engineering team, frantically shouting at software developers over the speakerphone while the entire operation ground to a halt. I did not panic. I did not freeze. I walked out onto the chaotic dispatch floor, grabbed a massive stack of blank carbon copy manifests, and completely took over. I stayed awake for 3 consecutive nights, consuming absolutely nothing but bitter black coffee and sheer, raw adrenaline. I manually mapped out incredibly complex heavy freight grid routes, using basic, old-school geographic dispatch logic. I personally coordinated the movement of over 200 separate cargo loads entirely by hand, meticulously matching driver weigh station limits to available chassis sizes. We did not lose a single major commercial retail account during that massive, humiliating blackout strictly because I absolutely refused to let the operational system die on my watch. By the brutal middle of year 3, the cruel, unforgiving mathematics of hypergrowth almost killed us permanently. Our corporate revenue was exploding beautifully on the financial projections, but our actual, tangible cash flow was completely paralyzed. Our massive enterprise clients operated on brutal net 90-day invoice cycles, holding our money hostage, but our diesel fuel vendors and our massive manual labor force demanded their payments every single week. On a freezing Tuesday morning, the accounting ledger revealed a terrifying truth. We were short by hundreds of thousands of dollars. We simply did not have the liquid capital to cover the massive Friday payroll. Grant sat at his desk, staring blankly at the white wall, completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of an imminent, highly public bankruptcy. I did not waste time offering empty emotional comfort. My grandmother had left me a modest, fully paid-off residential duplex on the quiet east side of the city. It was the only tangible, secure financial asset I possessed in the entire world. I drove directly to a regional commercial bank and legally pledged my sole separate property as absolute, unconditional collateral to secure a high-interest emergency bridge loan. I sat in a sterile bank office and signed my own name on the heavy stack of personal promissory notes, so that 140 exhausted warehouse workers and commercial drivers could actually feed their families that Friday afternoon. I literally gambled my only personal safety net to keep his fragile empire breathing. Inside the echoing, concrete walls of the warehouse and the perpetually chaotic dispatch center, the actual frontline workforce knew exactly who truly ran the daily operations. The grizzled dock managers and the exhausted shift supervisors understood perfectly well that if I took even a single day off, the entire complex supply chain would instantly descend into absolute, unrecoverable anarchy. Internally, the Human Resources Department and the senior logistics managers quietly, respectfully referred to me as the interim chief operating officer. I was the legally binding signature on all of our critical heavy-haul carrier agreements. I researched, negotiated, and signed the comprehensive workers' compensation insurance policies that protected our labor force. I authored and signed the highly sensitive emergency financial rescue minutes during our darkest months. I was the undisputed, absolute operational authority holding the structural integrity of the entire business together with my bare hands. Yet, that immense, undeniable authority vanished the exact moment the heavy glass corporate doors opened to the outside world. Whenever wealthy venture capital firms or prominent tech journalists flew in from the West Coast to tour the buzzing facility, the internal dynamic drastically and painfully shifted. Grant would pull me aside in the quiet hallway, quickly adjusting his expensive silk tie and smoothing his tailored suit. "Let me do the talking on strategy," he would instruct, his tone suddenly shifting from a desperate, dependent partner to a cold, condescending superior. "Just make sure the dispatch floor looks incredibly busy and the executive conference room is perfectly prepped. I need you keeping things running smoothly behind the scenes." I was aggressively, systematically pushed into the deep shadows. I was instantly reduced to an invisible, highly efficient administrator, while he confidently stood under the bright fluorescent lights, pointing directly at my complex operational metrics and proudly claiming them as his own solitary visionary triumphs. I did not aggressively fight him for the bright public spotlight. I did not demand a glowing press release, nor did I demand a seat at the polished mahogany table during the high-profile media interviews. I truly believed we were building a unified life. But my extensive, grueling background in corporate process optimization had permanently taught me one immutable, unforgiving law about human nature and high-stakes business and ecosystem is only just, and people are only held accountable if there is an unbroken, undeniable chain of hard physical evidence. I kept absolutely everything. I quietly built a massive, heavily fortified physical and digital archive of our entire operational history. I saved every single vendor contract addendum that I personally negotiated. I meticulously archived the critical, terrifying payroll shortage ledgers. I preserved the frantic, panicked internal email threads detailing the catastrophic system failures that I had personally resolved while he hid in his office. I kept the original, legally binding signed bank documents undeniably proving whose personal residential property actually secured the massive bridge loan. I maintained exhaustive, date-stamped operational meeting notes. I did this not because I anticipated a bitter, catastrophic divorce, but because I understood a fundamental, cold truth about corporate survival. I knew that historical reality is rarely what charismatic, powerful men choose to remember. Reality is exactly and only what you can undeniably prove on paper. As the corporate revenue aggressively climbed into the tens of millions of dollars, the very texture of my husband began to change. Massive financial success is a powerful, unforgiving solvent. It rapidly dissolves the humble veneer of a desperate, dependent founder and fully reveals the entitled ego buried underneath. Grant stopped drinking cheap beer with the warehouse shift managers on Friday nights. He started spending his weekends at exclusive, highly restricted country clubs, meticulously cultivating relationships with aggressive venture capitalists and private equity sharks. His inner circle of trusted advisors shifted from gritty, exhausted logistics veterans to slick, highly paid corporate strategists who spoke entirely in hypotheticals. And with that monumental shift in his environment came a subtle, insidious change in how he presented me to the public. During our early, terrifying years of survival, he used to introduce me at heavy industry dinners by pointing directly at me and telling everyone in the room that I was the absolute, undeniable engine of the company. Now, as we stood together in softly lit, incredibly expensive hotel ballrooms, his arm would casually drape over my shoulder in a display of patronizing ownership. "This is my lovely wife, Bryn," he would say, flashing a polished, heavily practiced smile at the wealthy investors. "She is the rock who always supports me from behind the scenes." It sounded like a gracious compliment to everyone else standing in the room. To me, it sounded exactly like a demotion. The complete erasure of my professional existence did not happen overnight. It was not a sudden, violent severing. It was a slow, methodical, highly calculated bleed. The deliberate removal began with the hiring of Lila Voss as our new director of communications. Lila was brought in during year 5 to aggressively professionalize our brand image ahead of a massive, highly anticipated Series B funding round. She audited our entire public and digital presence. Within exactly 3 months, every single digital trace of my executive footprint was scrubbed clean from the public record. When the newly redesigned corporate website launched, my biography was entirely absent from the leadership page. When I reviewed the glossy, expensive new investor pitch decks, the massive operational milestones I had personally bled to achieve were suddenly attributed to a vague, collective executive team. I was completely intentionally expunged from every single marketing brochure. It was not just the public-facing materials that were being sanitized. The internal history was being actively rewritten right in front of me. I started noticing that the official board meeting minutes were being drafted with incredibly vague, entirely passive language regarding my direct involvement. Where previous internal ledgers explicitly stated that I directed a massive vendor overhaul or personally vetoed a disastrous regional expansion, the new minutes simply noted that I was present in the room, perhaps casually facilitating the discussion. I was being documented on the permanent paper trail as an unpaid, helpful administrative assistant rather than a primary, equal co-creator of our explosive growth. When I quietly confronted Grant about these glaring, offensive omissions in his expansive, glass-walled corner office, he would simply sigh heavily, rub his temples, and look at me with manufactured, condescending exhaustion. He would tell me I was being entirely too sensitive, that corporate titles and public credit were just meaningless vanity metrics, and that our shared, massive bank account was the only proof of our joint success that truly mattered. But the bank accounts were changing, too, because I still retained my deep, ingrained professional habit of monitoring our financial architecture. I began noticing strange, highly erratic capital distributions. Large, unexplained sums of corporate profit were being quietly funneled out of Ironcrest's primary operating accounts and diverted into a newly formed, highly opaque legal entity called Mercer Meridian Holdings. I had never seen the formal incorporation documents for this fictitious holding company. I had never signed my name to approve its creation. One evening, as Grant was packing a heavy leather duffel bag for a prolonged 2-week investor roadshow, I stood in the doorway of his massive custom closet and calmly asked him to explicitly explain the exact nature of the Meridian distributions. He did not freeze. He did not look the least bit guilty. He simply laughed, a short, patronizing sound that echoed off the cedar walls. "Bryn," he said, using a tone specifically reserved for a confused, slow-witted child. "Do not try to understand the cap table if you do not live in finance. It is just standard, high-level corporate tax shielding. Let my expensive accountants handle the complex architecture." Shortly after that chilling conversation, the digital walls of the company began to rapidly close in on me. I woke up one Monday morning to find my administrative access to the primary corporate accounting software completely revoked. When I called the internal IT department, the young technician stammered nervously on the phone, claiming it was a mandatory, system-wide security protocol upgrade directed strictly by the chief executive officer. I was systematically being locked out of the very fortress I had designed and built with my own hands. Simultaneously, Grant began actively pushing me toward full-time household management. He enthusiastically encouraged me to step away from the stress of the office and focus entirely on renovating the massive, 10,000-square-foot estate we had recently purchased in the most affluent zip code in the entire county. He constantly framed it as a luxurious reward for my early sacrifices. He acted as though my forced, systematic retreat from the daily corporate operations was the natural, elegant evolution of a wealthy wife, rather than a deliberate, hostile extraction from the company. It was in the echoing, beautifully decorated halls of that newly purchased mansion that I experienced a profound, terrifying epiphany. Most women in failing high-net-worth marriages frantically look for the classic, chaotic signs of betrayal, the lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume on a jacket collar, the hidden prepaid phone, the sudden, entirely unexplained weekend business trips, I realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that Grant was not having a loud, messy, conventional affair. His betrayal was far more calculated, far more clinical, and infinitely more dangerous. I saw the very real danger not in another woman, but in the glaring fact that the man who once desperately needed my brilliant operational mind to survive now lived in absolute terror of the meticulous, undeniable paper trail I possessed. He was actively trying to erase my historical existence, so he would never have to share his legacy, or his massive equity, with anyone. The ultimate boiling point arrived during a private, completely silent dinner late in year 7. We were sitting at opposite ends of a massive, dark oak dining table. The heavy silence between us had grown so thick, it felt like actual physical pressure on my chest. I brought up a critical, highly dangerous liability flaw I had noticed in a new logistics contract he had proudly brought home for me to blindly applaud. I calmly pointed out that his expensive new legal team had completely missed a termination loophole that I would have caught in my sleep during our frantic startup days. Grant slowly dropped his heavy silver fork onto his expensive porcelain plate. The sharp, violent clatter completely shattered the tense silence of the room. He looked directly across the long length of the table, his eyes completely devoid of the warmth, partnership, or basic human respect that had once built our foundation. The carefully constructed mask finally slipped entirely. "You need to stop pretending you are actually playing at my level," he said, his voice deadly quiet and dripping with pure, unadulterated contempt. "What you do, what you have always done, is just small-scale operations, not value creation. Do not confuse your basic administrative chores with my visionary genius." That was the very first time the silent, creeping, insidious gaslighting was finally articulated into explicit, undeniable words. He had finally completely convinced himself of his own fabricated solo mythology. Exactly 4 weeks after that dinner, a man wearing a cheap gray suit knocked loudly on the heavy mahogany front door of my sprawling, completely isolated house and handed me a thick, heavy stack of legal documents. Grant had strategically filed for divorce first. As I sat completely alone in the vast, empty foyer, reading through the dense preliminary filings, I saw the exact, brutal legal strategy he and his high-priced litigators had pre-built over the last 2 years. The legal petition painted a meticulously crafted, highly offensive picture of Bryn Mercer, a wealthy, idle, spendthrift wife who contributed absolutely no substantive value to the marital estate, a woman who simply lived off the extraordinary, singular financial success of her brilliant husband. He had confidently locked the corporate doors, entirely rewritten the history books, and fully expected me to quietly disappear into the shadows with whatever meager, insulting severance package he deemed me worthy of receiving. The ink on the initial divorce petition was barely dry when the secondary, highly tactical assault commenced. Grant's legal team did not simply file standard dissolution papers. They executed a synchronized financial ambush. They aggressively petitioned the family court for a temporary ex parte order, successfully arguing that I posed an immediate flight risk to the marital assets. Within 48 hours of the initial filing, I stood at a local grocery store checkout lane, holding a basket of basic provisions, and watched the card reader violently decline my transaction. He had systematically frozen my access to every single joint checking, savings, and investment account we possessed. The very next morning, a bonded courier delivered a thick cream-colored envelope bearing his law firm's embossed logo. Inside was his proposed preliminary settlement agreement. It was an offer so profoundly low, so entirely disconnected from the actual stratospheric valuation of the company, that it read like a hostile joke. His attorneys framed the meager lump sum not as a rightful division of a shared life, but as a generous transition fee. The legal document boldly, shamelessly asserted that the primary sprawling estate, the exponentially appreciated corporate stock, and the massive liquid investment portfolios were entirely separate property. The petition claimed these assets were the exclusive, direct result of his singular premarital vision, entirely insulated from any meaningful contribution on my part. I did not provide them with the hysterical, unhinged reaction they were eagerly anticipating. I did not stage a dramatic, screaming breakdown in the echoing marble foyer of that massive house. I did not hurl expensive crystal glassware against the custom plaster walls, nor did I flood his voicemail with tearful, desperate pleas. Panic and rage are highly inefficient, utterly useless emotions in a war of attrition. I simply walked upstairs, packed 3 large suitcases with highly practical, neutral clothing, and hired a discreet local moving crew to secure the heavy plastic bins from my personal home office. I walked out the heavy front doors and never looked back. I signed a 12-month lease on a very clean, entirely unremarkable, incredibly quiet apartment on the north side of the city. It lacked sweeping views and custom architecture, but it offered absolute, undisturbed control. I unpacked my clothes, arranged my workstation, and immediately reinstated the rigid, unsentimental discipline that had defined my core character long before I ever met him. I woke up at 5 in the morning, ran 3 miles, drank black coffee, and meticulously planned my survival. Idle time breeds dangerous despair, and I required absolute, consuming focus. Within 3 weeks of leaving the estate, I accepted a senior director position at North Hollow Recovery Group. North Hollow was a boutique corporate restructuring firm that specialized in dissecting distressed, rapidly failing enterprises. My daily mandate was brutally simple: walk into mid-sized companies hovering on the absolute brink of total financial collapse and aggressively hunt for the toxic rot hiding beneath their polished, heavily sanitized executive summaries. I spent 10 to 12 hours a day locked in windowless data rooms, poring over thousands of pages of corporate distress. Immersing myself in this highly forensic environment radically sharpened my investigative senses. I became exceptionally attuned to the subtle, terrifying indicators of systemic corporate deceit. I learned to instantly spot highly irregular cash flow patterns that executives desperately tried to pass off as seasonal dips. I trained my eyes to catch conveniently missing appendix pages in heavily redacted vendor agreements. I learned to heavily scrutinize deliberately vague line items on expense reports, labeled simply as independent consulting services. I mapped out deeply irrational internal capital transfers specifically designed to hide bleeding, valuable assets from aggressive, circling creditors, every single day at North Hollow. I was clinically dissecting the exact same species of financial manipulation and structural shell games that my husband had quietly deployed in our own home over the last 2 years. During my second month in the new apartment, I finally drove to the sterile, climate-controlled storage unit to organize the heavy plastic bins I had hurriedly packed during my exit. I knelt on the cold, unforgiving concrete floor, physically popping the secure lids off the containers. There, resting securely at the very bottom beneath stacks of mundane tax returns, were the thick, heavy archival binders. I pulled them out one by one. I ran my fingers over the frayed plastic spines. I sat on the cold floor, opened them under the harsh overhead fluorescent light, and stared at the crisp, undeniable ink of our actual history. There was the initial commercial warehouse lease I had ruthlessly redlined, saving us from catastrophic penalties. There was the frantic, desperate bank correspondence from our darkest fiscal quarter, carefully filed chronologically. There were the intricate, handwritten payroll triage schedules I had built at 3 in the morning. And finally, preserved in a clear plastic sleeve, was the pristine, original execution copy of the emergency bridge loan, bearing my stark, undeniable signature over the collateral pledge of my grandmother's property. Sitting entirely alone in that dusty, dimly lit storage unit, the sharpest, most breathtaking pain of the entire ordeal finally crystallized in my mind. The agonizing, suffocating grief I felt was not about losing the vast, ridiculous wealth. It was not even about the ugly death of a romantic relationship that had been decaying for years. The true, unforgivable violence of his actions lay entirely in the absolute erasure. He was actively, systematically attempting to wipe me entirely off the historical map of a colossal structure we had bled side by side to build. He wanted the external world, the wealthy investors, and the legal system to firmly believe I was merely a fortunate parasite feeding off a brilliant host, rather than the critical skeletal system holding the entire organism upright. The deepest wound was the profound disrespect of a man trying to convince the world that I was a ghost in my own life. In that exact moment, the burning, a chaotic ember of personal heartbreak went completely cold, hardening instantly into something infinitely more dangerous. My objective irrevocably shifted. I completely abandoned any lingering, pathetic desire to win an emotional victory over him. I no longer cared if he ever looked at me with genuine remorse or finally acknowledged my worth behind closed doors. Apologies were utterly useless currency. I wanted something far more permanent. I resolved that when we finally stepped into that family courtroom, I would not present a narrative of a wounded, discarded spouse begging for a fair share. I would force the presiding judge to forensically examine the stark, load-bearing architecture of both our marriage and his precious, heavily guarded corporation. I would tear the decorative drywall off his fabricated, pristine empire and legally expose the heavy steel beams underneath, proving exactly whose hands had welded them together. I needed a weapon, not a weeping shoulder. That was exactly why I hired Tessa Vale. Tessa was a 50-year-old family law attorney who operated out of a remarkably sparse office in downtown Charlotte. She did not have mahogany bookshelves or oversized abstract art to intimidate opposing counsel. She had an absolute, terrifying stillness about her. Tessa famously despised arrogant men who walked into mediation rooms genuinely believing their weaponized charisma could substitute for hard, admissible evidence. When I sat across from her metal desk and slid my frayed, heavy binder across the glass surface, she did not offer me a tissue. She simply opened it, spent 45 minutes reading the densely packed pages in complete silence, and then looked up at me. "He is going to bleed," she said quietly. "But we have to map the arteries first." For the next 3 weeks, my rented apartment transformed into a hostile war room. We commandeered the entire living room wall, using heavy blue painter's tape to construct a massive chronological timeline. We were not mapping a broken marriage. We were reverse engineering a massive corporate fraud. We pinpointed the exact month the company revenue spiked by 400%. We cross-referenced that precise date with the exact Tuesday I walked into the commercial bank and legally chained my grandmother's duplex to his failing payroll. We mapped the exact quarter Lila Voss was hired to sanitize the public website, aligning it perfectly with the exact week my administrative access was quietly revoked. It was a terrifyingly clear, undeniable visual representation of my systematic execution. The first major crack in his pristine legal defense appeared during the mandatory discovery phase. Grant's expensive legal team dumped thousands of pages of corporate financial records onto our secure digital server. It was a classic litigation tactic designed to drown opposing counsel in irrelevant data. But Tessa was a sniper. She spent an entire weekend combing through the dense filings and noticed a glaring, highly deliberate surgical extraction. "Look at this," Tessa said, pointing to a brightly lit screen in her office on a Tuesday morning. They handed over the master loan agreements from year 3, but they intentionally excluded the supplementary financial appendices. They conveniently left out the exact 40 pages that legally mandate the personal collateral pledge. He was actively trying to hide the bridge loan from the judge. He was trying to pretend the company magically survived its darkest hour on his solitary genius alone. "Subpoena them," I replied, my voice hard and flat. "Subpoena Nolan Pike directly. And I want a subpoena served to the chief commercial lending officer at Cedar Ridge Commercial, the one who actually processed the emergency capital." Tessa smiled. It was a cold, dangerous expression. "Consider it done." As the heavy legal machinery began to turn, I plunged back into my own digital archives. I spent 70 hours over 10 days running complex Boolean searches through my massive, encrypted email backups from the early startup years. I was hunting for a specific ghost. At 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, my tired eyes finally caught a hidden attachment buried deep within a massive email thread regarding a vendor dispute. I clicked the file. It was a raw, unedited digital scan of the official board meeting minutes from the exact month the company nearly flatlined. There, printed in stark black ink on the second page, was my name. Beside it was the formal corporate title, Interim Chief Operating Officer. Below that was a formally recorded motion, unanimously passed, explicitly authorizing me to execute a comprehensive 90-day operational recovery plan. It was the absolute, undeniable smoking gun. It completely obliterated his sworn declaration that I merely managed the household while he built the empire. Armed with this devastating new ammunition, our hired forensic accountant, a brilliantly ruthless man named David, launched a full-scale assault on the Mercer Meridian Holdings accounts. David spent 2 solid weeks tracing highly complex, obscure digital wire transfers. What he uncovered was a masterclass in marital asset deflation. "Your husband is a very arrogant man, but he is not particularly creative," David explained, sliding a dense financial schematic across the conference table. Exactly 6 months before he filed the divorce petition. Right around the time he told you to stop worrying about the capitalization table. He began aggressively siphoning massive, irregular distributions out of the primary Ironcrest operating accounts. He funneled over $3 million directly into Meridian. David pointed to a series of highlighted ledger entries. He disguised the transfers as licensing fees for proprietary logistics software, but Meridian does not own any software. It is an empty shell. He was artificially depressing the valuation of the primary company right before the marital asset split, effectively hiding your rightful equity in a shadow corporation he completely controls. It was not just a profound personal betrayal. It was a highly calculated, heavily premeditated financial crime. The sheer weight of the subpoenas and the aggressive forensic inquiries inevitably triggered massive panic alarms inside Grant's camp. They suddenly realized we were not blindly crying over a broken heart. We were systematically dismantling the floorboards of his entire defense. Exactly 8 days before the scheduled preliminary hearing, Grant's lead attorney sent Tessa a highly urgent, strongly worded request for a private, off-the-record mediation session. They desperately wanted to settle the matter quietly. We met in a sterile, neutral conference room at a private arbitration firm downtown. Grant sat across the long wooden table, wearing a dark gray suit, looking tense and visibly fatigued. The effortless, magnetic charm he usually weaponized was completely absent. His lawyer slid a crisp, freshly printed settlement offer toward Tessa. It was a massive, undeniably life-changing amount of liquid cash. It was enough money to ensure I would live in absolute, insulated comfort for the next 50 years. It was 10 times the insulting amount they had originally offered in their opening volley. But attached to the back of the lucrative financial term sheet was a deeply restrictive, incredibly punitive non-disclosure agreement. I read the dense legal clauses slowly. The contract explicitly demanded that I immediately cease all forensic accounting investigations. It mandated that I permanently withdraw the subpoenas against his chief financial officer and his commercial bankers. Most importantly, it contained an ironclad, legally binding gag order strictly prohibiting me from ever publicly or privately claiming any historical role in the founding, operation, or scaling of Ironcrest transit systems. "It is a highly generous offer, Bryn," Grant said, leaning forward, attempting to soften his voice into something resembling his old affection. "You take this, and you never have to worry about a single bill again. We can just walk away cleanly. No messy public trials. No dragged-out warfare." I looked at the staggering string of zeros printed on the heavy paper. That depleted version of my former self, longing for a release from the crushing sorrow, would have picked up that weighty pen and relinquished every last thing simply to attain a sense of calm. But the woman sitting in that chair had spent the last several months staring directly into the dark, hollow core of his deceit. I looked up from the contract and met his gaze. I saw exactly what he was trying to buy. He was not paying me for my rightful share of the marital estate. He was trying to purchase my permanent silence. He was offering me a massive fortune to legally co-sign his fabricated mythology. To sign that document meant looking the entire world in the eye and officially agreeing that I had built absolutely nothing. It meant allowing him to successfully murder my history and walk away with impeccably clean hands. I slowly closed the heavy leather portfolio and pushed it back across the smooth wooden table. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet completely steady. Grant's jaw tightened violently. "You are being completely irrational. You will never see a number this high inside a courtroom. You still do not understand what this is about, do you?" I replied, standing up from the heavy leather chair. "Keep your money, Grant. I will see you in court." I walked out of the mediation room, leaving the massive settlement sitting on the table. The war was no longer about securing a comfortable financial future. It was about violently reclaiming the truth. The weeks leading up to the final trial date were an exercise in suffocating social warfare. Grant did not prepare by reviewing financial ledgers or operational timelines. He prepared by rigorously campaigning in the most exclusive zip codes in the city. He was a flawless fixture at high society charity galas, expensive private equity dinners, and the hushed, leather-bound lounges of elite golf clubs. He operated with the lethal, quiet efficiency of a seasoned politician. He did not yell. He did not explicitly call me a villain. Instead, he carefully planted seeds of condescending pity. He would stand near a polished mahogany bar, swirling a glass of 30-year-old scotch, and look deeply sorrowful as he spoke to influential board members. "Bryn simply could not handle the velocity of my success," he would murmur, shaking his head with manufactured tragedy. "She is a wonderful woman, truly. But as the company scaled past the startup phase, the pressure completely fractured her. She just wanted a simple life, and I could not stop growing. Now, she is lashing out." It was a brilliantly toxic narrative. He was actively reframing my calculated, forensic resistance as the hysterical thrashing of a mediocre wife who had been painfully left behind by a visionary husband. The heavy pressure of this fabricated social consensus began to seep under my door. Several mutual acquaintances suddenly felt the urge to offer me unsolicited, deeply patronizing advice. One afternoon, a woman named Claire, whose husband sat on the advisory board of a rival logistics firm, insisted on buying me a cup of coffee. She wore a perfectly tailored beige cashmere coat and looked at me with an expression of profound, weary sympathy. "Bryn, you have to look at the reality of this situation," Claire said, leaning across the small marble table. "Take the settlement money. It is an astronomical amount. You can travel the world, buy a beautiful new home, and completely reinvent yourself. Why are you dragging yourself through the mud of a public trial? Men like Grant, men with that level of capital and social leverage, they always win when things get messy in public. The system is entirely built to protect them. You are just going to destroy your own reputation for absolutely no reason." I looked at her perfectly manicured hands resting on the table. She genuinely believed she was saving me. She could not comprehend that I was not fighting for a higher tier of alimony. I was fighting to reclaim my stolen professional identity. "I am not afraid of the mud, Claire," I replied evenly. I poured the concrete. The very next morning, the fragile, polished illusion Grant was aggressively selling to the elite class suffered a massive, unexpected blow from the working class. My phone rang just after 7 o'clock. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar local number. "Miss Bryn, it is Derek Solis." The heavy, gravelly voice instantly pulled me back to the freezing concrete floor of our first industrial warehouse. Derek was the grizzled, relentless daytime warehouse manager who had run the loading docks during our most chaotic, terrifying early years. He was not a man who cared about stock options or corporate branding. He cared about heavy machinery and keeping the commercial freight moving on schedule. "Derek," I answered, genuine surprise breaking my normally rigid tone. "It has been a very long time." "I am calling because I'm sick of the garbage I'm hearing," Derek said bluntly, skipping any polite pleasantries. "Some of the corporate suits from the new headquarters came down to the floor last week. They were talking loud about the divorce. They were repeating Grant's new story, saying you were just a housewife who picked out the office furniture and planned the holiday parties. It made my blood boil. There was a brief pause on the line, accompanied by the sound of a heavy diesel engine idling in the background. I was there, Miss Bryn, Derek continued, his voice thick with raw indignation. I know exactly who kept the lights on when the routing software completely tanked in year 4. I know who personally walked down to the loading bay and de-escalated that massive strike when the regional drivers did not get their paychecks on time. Grant hid in his glass office and panicked. You stood on a wooden pallet and fixed it. Thank you, Derek, I said quietly. But Grant has a team of very expensive lawyers rewriting that exact history right now. Let them try to rewrite my inbox, Derek shot back. I never delete anything. I'm sending a secure file to your personal email right now. It has over 200 messages from those first 3 years. Direct orders from you. You untangling the supply chain bottlenecks. You handling the major client emergencies when they threaten to pull their contracts. You restructuring the entire human resources protocol. It is all there in black and white. When I opened the encrypted file an hour later, I felt a sharp, cold rush of absolute vindication. Derek had handed me the exact operational ground truth that Lila Voss and Grant's slick corporate strategists had desperately tried to scrub from the company servers. Later that afternoon, I sat in Tessa Vale's sparse downtown office as we reviewed the final, desperate strategic pivots from opposing counsel. Grant's legal team had formally filed a motion to severely limit the introduction of my physical archives. They are going to try a very classic, highly misogynistic deflection strategy, Tessa explained, tapping her pen against the legal pad. They are going to aggressively frame your binders, your spreadsheets, and your meticulous record-keeping as a cute, obsessive personal journaling habit. They are going to stand in front of the judge and call your company-saving operational blueprints an exaggerated, neurotic housewife scrapbook. They want to strip the professional authority away from your documents by painting them as the desperate hobby of a woman with too much free time. Let them call it a scrapbook, I replied, staring at the thick stack of printed emails Derek had just provided. We will see how a scrapbook holds up under cross-examination when their own chief financial officer takes the oath. The night before the trial, my apartment was completely silent. Most people facing the total dissolution of a 12-year marriage and a massive, highly public financial battle would be pacing the floors, drinking heavily, or sobbing uncontrollably into a pillow. I did none of those things. I did not stand in front of the bathroom mirror rehearsing grand, emotional, cinematic speeches. Instead, I sat perfectly upright at my kitchen table with a timer. I rigorously practiced the precise cadence of my testimony. I trained myself to deliver short, surgical, completely factual answers. I systematically stripped every single ounce of emotion, anger, and bitterness from my vocal tone. I knew that the moment I showed genuine hurt, the moment my voice cracked or my eyes watered, Grant's attorneys would immediately pounce. They would use my emotional pain as absolute proof of my instability. I refused to give them the ammunition of my grief. Before I finally turned off the small desk lamp, I opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet and pulled out a single, slightly faded photograph. It was a picture of the modest brick duplex my grandmother had left me. I stared at the peeling white paint on the front porch for a very long time. I traced the edge of the photograph with my thumb. I realized then the fundamental difference between my husband and me. Grant was a man who played heavily with other people's capital. He risked venture funding. He risked corporate debt. But he always kept his own personal safety rigorously insulated. I had literally wagered the only roof I owned. I had bet my absolute, fundamental survival on our shared dream. There were heavy, terrifying things I had confidently placed on the gambling table of this marriage that Grant Mercer had never possessed the courage to risk. The next morning, the air in the long marble hallway outside the family courtroom was thick and aggressively cold. I stood perfectly still near the heavy wooden double doors, holding my dark briefcase, flanked by Tessa. The heavy brass elevator doors at the end of the corridor slid open. Grant stepped out, surrounded by his usual phalanx of aggressive, highly paid litigators. He wore a stunning charcoal suit and a perfectly knotted silk tie. When he saw me standing there, he did not look away. He stopped a few feet away from me and offered a slow, incredibly confident smile. It was the relaxed, victorious smirk of a man who genuinely believed the final score had already been completely predetermined by his wealth and his manufactured social standing. I looked directly back into his eyes and did not offer a single expression in return. Let him smile, I thought. I understood perfectly well that his arrogant confidence was a highly fragile currency. That patronizing smile only held its value as long as the truth remained locked in a box, and in exactly 10 minutes, I was going to force him to open it in front of the world. Grant took the witness stand with the practiced, effortless grace of a man who had spent the last decade convincing hostile boardrooms to hand him millions of dollars. Under the gentle, guiding direct examination of his lead attorney, he masterfully painted the portrait of the brilliant, isolated genius. He spoke in a measured, reasonable tone, successfully casting himself as the tragic victim of a greedy, vindictive divorce. To the untrained observers sitting in the back rows of the gallery, his narrative was profoundly convincing. He was the exhausted titan. I was the ungrateful beneficiary of his relentless labor. "Can you describe your former wife's role during the formative years of Ironcrest?" his attorney asked, lobbing a perfectly weighted softball over the plate. Grant adjusted his suit jacket, looking at the judge with a heavy, sorrowful expression. Bryn was supportive, of course. She helped with a few minor administrative chores around the office. She picked out the initial desk furniture. She organized some of the early utility bills and planned the holiday luncheons. But she did not create any high-level strategy. She did not generate a single dollar of revenue. She held absolutely no management role. He paused, letting the silence hang in the suffocating air of the courtroom, before delivering the final, fatal blow his legal team had undoubtedly focus grouped for maximum damage. "She built nothing," Grant stated clearly, his voice echoing off the varnished wooden walls. "She was just there when I built it." I did not gasp. I did not shake my head in furious denial. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the defense table, and stared straight ahead. I let that incredibly arrogant, highly definitive statement land squarely on the official court reporter's transcript. Beside me, Tessa Vale did not even object. She simply wrote a single word on her yellow legal pad and underlined it twice. Tessa knew that in high-stakes litigation, sometimes the greatest gift an opposing counsel can receive is a wealthy man whose towering ego forces him to make absolute, easily disprovable statements under the penalty of perjury. When the bailiff finally called my name, I walked to the witness stand with the heavy, unyielding discipline I had practiced the night before. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. I did not launch into a tearful, melodramatic recounting of our 12-year marriage. I did not speak about broken promises, emotional neglect, or the agonizing death of our shared dream. The family court was not a therapist's office. It was a forensic laboratory, and I was there to present the raw data. Under Tessa's sharp, rapid-fire questioning, my voice remained completely flat and aggressively even. I was impossible to fluster. I methodically laid out the precise operational milestones of the company. I detailed the severe cash flow risks we faced in Q3 of Year 2. I recited the exact schedule of personal liability guarantees I had signed to secure the commercial freight leases. I explained the complex, manual dispatch routing protocols I built during the catastrophic software failure, citing the exact dates and the specific retail clients I had personally salvaged. Grant's lead litigator practically leapt out of his heavy leather chair, his face flushed with sudden, unmasked panic. He recognized immediately that I was not playing the role of the hysterical, discarded wife. I was testifying like a hostile chief operating officer. "Objection, Your Honor," the lawyer barked, his voice sharp and aggressive. "Relevance." Opposing counsel is leading her client through a highly exaggerated, purely emotional narrative disguised as operational history. These granular, mundane office tasks have absolutely no bearing on the legal classification of the marital assets. The plaintiff's premarital intellectual property is the sole driver of the corporate valuation. Judge Evelyn Harrow peered down from the elevated bench, her expression an unreadable mask of judicial authority. Overruled. I will allow the testimony to proceed. The court is highly interested in the structural foundation of the disputed enterprise. Tessa nodded respectfully to the judge, turned back to me, and walked over to the plaintiff's table. She picked up a thick, securely bound manila folder. It was not the sanitized, heavily redacted discovery file Grant's team had submitted weeks ago. It was my file. Your Honor, at this time, the defense would like to introduce Exhibit D into evidence, Tessa announced, her voice slicing through the tense silence of the room. This is the complete, unredacted documentary package for the commercial bridge loan executed in November of Year 3. The exact month Ironcrest Transit Systems lacked the liquid capital to cover its basic payroll obligations. The reaction at Grant's table was instantaneous and violent. Grant physically stiffened, the confident smirk entirely vanishing from his face, replaced by a sudden, rigid pallor. His lead attorney slammed his hand flat against the table and stood up so fast his heavy chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. Fierce objection, Your Honor, the lawyer shouted, entirely abandoning his previously polished courtroom etiquette. This specific document package was not fully authenticated during the final discovery round. The defense is attempting a trial by ambush with unverified, highly prejudicial financial paperwork. Tessa did not raise her voice. She simply handed the thick packet to the bailiff, who carried it up to the judge. Your Honor, the documents were legally subpoenaed directly from the commercial lending officer at Cedar Ridge Commercial. They bear the original, wet ink signatures, and they contain the critical financial appendices that the plaintiff deliberately chose to omit from his own mandatory disclosures. Judge Harrow did not immediately respond to the screaming objection. The entire courtroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound was the crisp rustle of thick paper as the judge slowly turned the pages of the loan agreement. She bypassed the standard boilerplate language and went straight to the final appendix. She pushed her reading glasses down the bridge of her nose and stared intently at the heavy, undeniable signature block legally pledging my grandmother's residential duplex as the sole collateral for the corporate survival fund. She looked up from the page. She did not look at Grant's screaming lawyer. She looked directly past the wooden barricade, straight into the second row of the gallery, where Nolan Pike, the chief financial officer of Ironcrest, was currently sitting. Nolan looked as though all the blood had been rapidly drained from his body. He was sweating visibly, clutching his knees. Judge Harrow picked up her heavy wooden gavel, but did not strike it. She simply leaned forward, her voice carrying a cold, terrifying judicial weight that instantly silenced the entire room. The objection is overruled, and the exhibit is admitted into the official record, Judge Harrow stated cleanly. We will now take a mandatory 90-minute recess for lunch. However, before anyone leaves this room, I am issuing a direct order to the gallery. Mr. Nolan Pike, you are legally commanded to remain on the premises. Immediately following the recess, you will take the stand under oath. I have several highly specific questions regarding the exact origin of this corporate capital. Grant sat frozen in his chair, staring blankly ahead. His highly paid legal team frantically leaned in around him, whispering in panicked, rapid tones. The polished, impregnable fortress he had spent the last 2 years carefully constructing to erase my existence had just sustained a massive, catastrophic structural breach. As I stood up to leave the defense table for the break, I looked at Grant. He finally understood that the trial was no longer a performance. The ground beneath his feet was rapidly giving way, and the terrifying plunge had officially begun. When the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open after the 90-minute recess, the atmosphere inside the room had fundamentally mutated. The sterile, bureaucratic boredom that typically accompanied family law proceedings was entirely gone, replaced by the electric, suffocating tension of an active crime scene. Grant Mercer did not swagger back to his seat at the plaintiff's table. He walked stiffly, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped visibly beneath his skin. His lead attorney, the man who had been so incredibly arrogant just hours prior, now looked physically ill, frantically flipping through a stack of legal pads, as if hoping to magically find a different set of facts hidden between the yellow pages. Nolan Pike, the chief financial officer of Ironcrest Transit Systems, walked to the witness stand like a man marching directly to his own execution. He raised his right, trembling hand, swore the binding oath to tell the absolute truth, and sat down heavily in the wooden chair. His face was a pale, sickly gray. He aggressively adjusted his silk tie, his eyes darting frantically between Grant's furious, threatening glare and the highly imposing figure of Judge Evelyn Harrow. Nolan was inherently a numbers man, a pragmatic corporate survivor. He knew precisely the terrifying legal chasm he was currently staring into. He had to make an immediate, brutal choice. He could either protect the fragile, fabricated narrative of his violently angry boss and face a devastating felony perjury charge, or he could tell the truth and destroy his career at the company. Judge Harrow did not wait for Tessa to begin the formal examination. She bypassed standard protocol, leaning forward and resting her forearms on the heavy mahogany bench, taking absolute, terrifying control of the room. She looked directly down at Nolan, her voice completely devoid of any judicial warmth or patience. "Mr. Pike," Judge Harrow began, her tone slicing cleanly through the dead silence of the gallery, "I am holding a legally authenticated commercial loan document that your legal team actively attempted to conceal from this court. I have a very simple, direct question for you. When Ironcrest Transit Systems had exactly enough liquid capital left to cover only 11 days of payroll, who physically signed the personal guarantee that legally forced the bank to disperse the survival funds?" Nolan swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously against his collar. He rigidly refused to look over at the plaintiff's table. "Bryn Chapman," Nolan answered. His voice cracked slightly on the first syllable, but the two words echoed clearly off the high ceiling. The entire courtroom went instantly, profoundly silent. The heavy, expensive illusion Grant had spent the entire morning spinning shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I watched my husband out of the corner of my eye. For the very first time in our 12 years together, Grant entirely lost his flawless composure in a public setting. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. He gripped the edge of the defense table so incredibly hard his knuckles turned completely white. The second question from the bench came much faster, hitting Nolan like a physical strike before he could even catch his breath. "And who authored the highly detailed 90-day operational recovery plan that was legally required to convince your commercial investors and this specific bank not to pull their funding entirely?" Judge Harrow asked, her eyes narrowing sharply behind her glasses. "Bryn Chapman," Nolan replied, his posture completely collapsing inward. He gripped the edges of the witness stand. "She wrote the entire operational manual. She built the recovery metrics." Judge Harrow picked up a printed, glossy copy of the company's current executive pitch deck. She held it high in the air for the entire room to see. "Then perhaps you can explain to this court, Mr. Pike, why this woman's executive title, her operational history, and her name have been systematically scrubbed from the corporate website, the board decks, and all recent financial disclosures," Nolan stammered, pulling desperately at his collar again. He looked toward Grant's highly paid lawyers for salvation, but they were staring firmly down at their legal pads, entirely abandoning him to the slaughter. "It was a strategic directive," Nolan finally mumbled, his voice trembling under the immense weight of the confession. "We were ordered to execute a complete leadership brand repositioning. The directive came directly from the chief executive officer. Grant explicitly instructed the communications team and the financial department to remove her operational footprint from all public and internal records going forward. It was a full, unmitigated forensic slaughter." But Tessa was not finished tearing down the walls. Nolan was swiftly excused from the stand, practically running back to the safety of the gallery. The bailiff immediately called the senior commercial lending representative from Cedar Ridge Commercial to the stand. The banker, a stern, impeccably dressed woman in a navy suit, possessed absolutely no loyalty to Grant or his corporate mythology. Under Tessa's rapid surgical questioning, the banker coldly confirmed the absolute reality of our darkest corporate era. During the critical crisis phase in year 3, the banker testified smoothly, consulting her thick file, my institution did not communicate with Grant Mercer. He was entirely absent from the emergency financial triage meetings. Our sole point of contact for every single operational metric, every cash flow projection, and every emergency logistical pivot was Bryn. We authorized the massive capital injection strictly because she held the actual, verified numbers, and she put her own private real estate on the line to secure the debt. Frankly, we viewed her as the actual, functional operating engine of the enterprise, while her husband merely handled the external sales pitches. Grant's lead attorney weakly attempted to stand and object, desperately citing relevance, but Judge Harrow immediately shut him down with a furious, highly dismissive wave of her hand. The momentum against them was an absolute avalanche, to deliver the final, lethal blow of the afternoon. Tessa called our forensic accountant back to the stand. David carried his heavy ledgers with the supreme confidence of a seasoned hunter who had successfully cornered his prey. He did not speak in vague legal theories or emotional pleas. He spoke in hard, undeniable arithmetic. David systematically projected the highly obscured banking records onto the large digital screen mounted on the courtroom wall. He traced the exact, irrefutable financial timeline. He explicitly showed the judge how the company survived its fragile infancy entirely on the back of my separate property collateral. Then, he flipped the digital timeline forward to the exact months immediately preceding the initial divorce filing. While the company literally owed its continued existence to the defendant's personal financial risk, David explained clearly, pointing a red laser directly at a series of massive, highly irregular cash outflows. The plaintiff began quietly bleeding the shared corporate accounts. He siphoned millions of dollars through fictitious licensing fees into a completely empty shadow entity named Mercer Meridian Holdings. He deliberately executed these massive, unapproved transfers right before serving the divorce papers. This was an active, highly aggressive strategy to artificially and fraudulently reduce the visible value of the marital estate, ensuring his wife would receive a mere fraction of her rightful equity. That was the absolute breaking point. Grant could not physically tolerate the public, mathematical destruction of his towering ego. He completely abandoned his carefully crafted, highly elegant persona. He shoved his heavy wooden chair back violently, the sound screeching across the floor, and stood up right in the middle of the accountant's damning testimony. "That is a complete, malicious fabrication," Grant shouted, his voice harsh and grating, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at David. Those were highly legitimate, complex corporate tax strategies. She did not understand the architecture of the business. She was just a glorified secretary who got incredibly lucky by being married to me. "Sit down immediately, Mr. Mercer, or I will hold you in direct contempt of this court and have you physically removed," Judge Harrow roared, striking her heavy wooden gavel with explosive, deafening force. Grant froze instantly. He stood there breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his expensive tailored suit. He looked frantically around the room, realizing entirely too late what he had just done. His explosive, vicious, highly irrational outburst completely contradicted the calm, collected, profoundly reasonable testimony he had offered just 3 hours earlier. He had spent the entire morning painting himself as a gentle, generous titan dealing with a hysterical, greedy wife. Now, he was screaming wildly in open court, confirming to everyone exactly who he truly was behind the polished glass doors. The entire axis of the trial had violently shifted. The narrative was no longer about a freeloading wife aggressively demanding unearned capital. The undeniable, heavily documented truth had fully materialized in the room. The court was no longer looking at a visionary founder trying to protect his sole asset. They were looking at a deeply insecure, highly fraudulent man who had desperately, systematically tried to erase his wife's bloody fingerprints from the very foundation of the massive skyscraper she had helped him build. I sat perfectly still at the defense table. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not offer him a single ounce of emotional reaction. I just watched the lies he had built collapse under their own weight. The final ruling was not delivered with a dramatic slam of a wooden gavel, but with a cold, surgical precision that permanently altered the trajectory of both our lives. Exactly 2 weeks after the explosive, foundational testimonies of the chief financial officer and the forensic accountant, we returned to the Mecklenburg County Family Court for the official judgment. Judge Evelyn Harrow did not mince her words. She looked directly at the plaintiff's table, her expression a rigid mask of absolute judicial disdain. I have thoroughly reviewed the extensive financial disclosures, the operational logs, and the highly credible testimony provided during this trial, Judge Harrow began, her voice ringing clearly across the heavy, silent room. For the permanent court record, I find the plaintiff, Grant Mercer, to be completely lacking in credibility. The plaintiff has intentionally and maliciously misrepresented the defendant's foundational role within the enterprise. Furthermore, the plaintiff engaged in a deliberate, highly orchestrated effort to conceal the true nature of the marital assets through the use of obscure bad-faith corporate structuring. Grant sat rigidly in his chair, his face a sickening shade of pale gray. His high-priced lawyers were entirely silent, staring down at their blank yellow legal pads. They knew the devastating, unavoidable blow was coming, and they could do absolutely nothing to stop it. The court firmly rejects the plaintiff's core legal argument, Judge Harrow continued, methodically turning the crisp pages of her final decree. The most significant period of exponential growth for Ironcrest Transit Systems cannot, by any reasonable legal or financial metric, be categorized as the sole, independent genius of the plaintiff. That monumental growth was directly, undeniably tethered to the rigorous operational management executed by Bryn Chapman. Furthermore, the company was entirely salvaged by her willingness to encumber her own separate, premarital real estate to secure the financial survival of the corporation. The financial judgment handed down was an absolute earthquake that fractured the very foundation of his corporate identity. I was formally awarded a massive, equitable 50% share in the exponentially appreciated value of the entire logistics empire we had cultivated during our marriage. The court mandated a full, immediate reimbursement of my original separate property contribution, forcefully compounding it with several years of retroactive, high-yield commercial interest. But Judge Harrow did not stop at simply dividing the wealth. She heavily penalized his staggering arrogance. She ordered Grant to personally liquidate his own separate assets to cover a highly significant portion of my extensive legal fees. To ensure his complete, undeniable compliance, the court imposed a strict, highly aggressive independent oversight committee to heavily monitor the final corporate valuation. She legally froze Mercer Meridian Holdings, the very shadow entity he had secretly created to drain my equity before the trial. He was now entirely locked inside his own financial trap, completely unable to move a single dollar without the explicit documented approval of a court-appointed forensic auditor. Grant could no longer maintain his forced, polished silence. The total, public destruction of his ego proved entirely too much for him to bear. He suddenly stood up, leaning aggressively over the plaintiff's table, his voice desperate and reeking of wounded pride. "Your Honor, she is grossly exaggerating a few minor operational tasks into full corporate ownership," Grant protested, his voice echoing frantically off the high ceiling. "I was the face of the brand. I sold the vision." Judge Harrow did not even look up from her paperwork. "Sit down, Mr. Mercer," she commanded sharply, her voice striking the room like a physical blow. Nobody saves a dying enterprise from a catastrophic payroll collapse, signs a massive personal collateral guarantee, authors a comprehensive 90-day operational survival plan, and then gets defined by this court as someone who built nothing. Your legal motion is completely denied. I did not turn my head to look at him. I did not need to witness his pathetic, crumbling facade to feel the profound weight of my victory. The most powerful, intoxicating moment of the entire grueling ordeal was not hearing the massive financial figures read aloud by the judge. The true victory was the heavy, suffocating silence radiating from his side of the room. In that precise moment, I knew Grant finally understood the terrifying truth. He finally realized that my quiet, stoic demeanor over the last 12 years was never a symptom of weakness or submission. My calmness was the terrifying stillness of a woman who had already meticulously prepared the absolute truth. When the proceedings officially concluded, I gathered my heavy leather briefcase and walked out of the courtroom beside Tessa. The heavy wooden doors closed behind us, echoing down the long marble corridor. Outside the courthouse, down on the sweeping concrete steps, a small cluster of local legal reporters and business journalists were already waiting. They had clearly caught wind of the spectacular corporate implosion happening inside the family court. They thrust their small digital recorders and microphones toward me, desperately hoping for a bitter, highly quotable soundbite from the scorned, victorious wife. I stopped on the bottom step. I looked at the flashing cameras and the eager faces. A younger, more wounded version of myself might have taken that golden opportunity to publicly humiliate him, to scream my frustrations into the microphones and declare my ultimate, fiery revenge to the press. Instead, I simply took a deep, steadying breath of the crisp afternoon air. I adjusted the strap of my bag, offered the press a polite, entirely unreadable smile, and walked directly past them toward my waiting car. I let my absolute silence accomplish what I had been unable to do for over a decade. I let my undeniable, legally proven value speak entirely for itself. The very next morning, the sun streamed brightly through the large glass windows of my new office at North Hollow Recovery Group. The air smelled of fresh coffee and expensive printer ink. I sat behind my solid oak desk and opened a small, sleek cardboard box that had just been delivered by the administrative assistant. Inside rested a stack of freshly printed, heavy cardstock business cards. I picked one up and ran my thumb over the raised, crisp black lettering. It read, Bryn Chapman, Partner, Operational Recovery. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and looked out over the bustling city skyline. I felt a profound, settling peace wash over my entire being. I finally understood the ultimate, poetic justice of the situation. The absolute deepest, most agonizing pain Grant Mercer would suffer for the rest of his life would not be the loss of the tens of millions of dollars. He was a ruthless corporate survivor. He would eventually make more money. The true, inescapable torture for a man consumed by his own fabricated mythology was the permanent, undeniable historical record. The family court, the financial auditors, the corporate ledgers, and his own executive future were now legally forced to recognize a single, unchangeable fact. The woman he confidently stood in front of a judge and claimed had built absolutely nothing was, in reality, the exact person who had built infinitely more than he ever possessed the courage to admit. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and I would love to hear where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Amelia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your extra support by hitting the hype button, so this story can be heard by even more people.